Stevie Squire Show, WQBK, October 11, 1979.
Be with you.
Glad to have you here. It's been a long, hard time. We started talking about this last spring, I think, so glad you got back from vacation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Gordon, let's start right off. Let me ask you, where are our public schools? What's going on in New York State education? Everybody seems very pessimistic. This is bad, that's bad. Something. Is it as bad as it seems?
I'm very optimistic about our educational system, both our public and non-public schools. I think it's important to keep in mind the quality of education in New York State. I know there are lots of concerns that we have across the state about quality, but let me just give you one indicator. We've been testing children in the 3rd and the 6th grades in reading and mathematics since 1966. The scores in reading and mathematics today in the 3rd grade are higher than they have ever been since 1966. And the scores at the 6th grade level in reading are higher than they've ever been since 66, and the math scores are almost up to where they were in 66. This is after we saw a decline in scores from 66 down to about 1971. So our scores, particularly at the lower grades in those foundation skills, have been going up, and we are at top levels for the most part. We're also in very good shape by way of our secondary school students. If you compare scores in our state against other states on things like the SATs or the ACTs, these are tests for admission to college, or if you look at our students in their competition in merit scholarships or advanced placement or Westinghouse competitions, New York State students do proportionately very, very well. We have 7.5% of the seniors in the nation, but they win 15% of the merit scholarships, and they win 37% of the Westinghouse, and they do 22% of the advanced placements. So we've got a lot to be proud of by way of quality. We can always improve it, but we've got a good base to work with.
Well, that's encouraging because we don't see state figures that much, but we do see all these figures that SAT scores are going down like the stock market. And this is nationally, I realize, but if our scores are coming up, and our college placements are good, maybe we're doing something right in the state. But the thing that I find that so many people who call in on the show worry about, that we certainly read about in the media, etc., is the kind of students and the discipline in the schools that maybe the kids aren't learning what they should because really the schools are serving as babysitters, that there's no discipline. The problem is the teachers have their hands tied, or the teachers are not capable of disciplining. You hear both sides. Would you comment on that?
I'd comment on it by way of observation for the opening of school this year. I think your observation, if you go back a few years, was an observation that's in large part correct. But I've traveled all over the state, even just this last September, and I think the school has opened in a very strong fashion. Children are down to business. Faculty members are. We have new requirements for competency testing and so on. And I get a sense right across the state that it's really very, very businesslike and a very effective opening. We're concerned about the issue of discipline. And the Regents and I have been holding and will continue to hold a series of regional conferences all across our state where we discuss with parents, with students, with school administrators, the ways in which we can improve discipline. You've got to have strong discipline in order to have a concentration on learning. The two go together. In fact, learning is the development of a self-discipline in the student. We're very conscious of this, but I think once again we can be optimistic that there has been a good, strong opening of school this year, and I'm confident that's going to continue right in through this year.
That's very encouraging. I read an article, which you may have seen, that was in the Times, I think. When's that science page? On Tuesday. I think it was this Tuesday. Written by, I forgot to cut the darn thing out, written by someone who was a radical educator, and he's become a more conservative educator. Did you see this? The article, I can't remember the name of his book. One of the things, he felt that they had to go back to more traditional forms of education. One of the things he said, aside from the classroom part, was dress code, which sometimes ties in with discipline in people's minds, that he thought it was time to go back to some kind of a dress code. I'm thinking about your predecessor and all the headaches he had over dress codes and slacks and whatever. Does this come up in thinking, as long as we're talking discipline, does this come up at all?
It comes up from time to time. Of course, what kind of code or what kind of provisions you'll have in any local school district is really at the option of that district or indeed of that school. The article that you referred to is about one of those who was 15 years ago arguing very vigorously for open classroom and arguing very vigorously that there should be a great deal of flexibility in the school program. He is now taking the position that, in fact, children like more structure, and that by way of organizing the school program and getting at what is most important to be done in the elementary and secondary schools, that it's really necessary to concentrate on foundation skills, and accompanying that is his idea about pretty firm discipline and a fair measure of control within the schools. My observation, not in all the schools, but certainly in many of them, again this fall, is that if you do look at dress patterns, you will see that on their own, children have been changing their dress patterns.
My daughter left yesterday in skirt and stockings, and I said, "Where are you going?" I thought maybe she wasn't going to go to school at all. I was amazed. Yeah, it is a definite change. Yeah, that's encouraging. But he wanted to come back to more discipline in general and more of a structure. It's part of the back to basics idea.
Or forward to fundamentals.
Oh, all right. That's a better way of looking at it. I like that better.
That's been used, and that is a catchphrase, if you will, forward to fundamentals. But the concept, I think, is really the same. And what's most important is what we consider, and I mean the society as a whole, not just those who are in teaching or those who are in education, but what we as a society expect our schools to be doing. And I think there's a much clearer focus that what we should be doing at heart in the schools is assuring that all of our children get a good foundation in their capacity to read, in their capacity to write, and I would emphasize writing, in their capacity to express themselves, their oral communication, and in their capacity to handle computation, arithmetic, logic, reasoning, so that, in fact, they can move from those skills to tackle much more difficult tasks in later schooling and also tasks that they'll have to be handling throughout their lives.
Okay, let me take time out here for a message or two, and then we'll see if anybody... I have a million questions, and I'm sure many of our listeners do, too. So our number is 463-1111, and we'll get to the phone in about a minute or so. A very patient person.
Yes. Okay, Commissioner Ambach.
Yes?
Is he there?
Yes, he's there. If you cannot hear him, I'm going to ask you to ask your question maybe and then hang up. I'm not sure if his mic is working through the telephone or not.
All right. Well, I'm a strong supporter of Title IX. I want to know if the Commissioner, I assume he supports Title IX. I hope so.
I certainly do.
What New York State is doing to move us up in the position of the states, I see by the latest TIER report. That's a national organization which monitors Title IX. But New York State is not in the top of any of the areas which Title IX encompasses. So I'll hang up, Stevie, and ask the Commissioner what we're doing in New York State to help Title IX.
Fine, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm not sure what indicators you were referring to in that report, but let me comment on some key activities in the state. One of them that I'm very close to is our promotion of effort to advance the number of women who are involved in educational administration. I have an advisory council on opportunity for women in education, comprised of about 20 persons who serve all of our state, both in higher education administrative positions and particularly in elementary and secondary school positions. They have assisted throughout the state in the recruitment of and in the placement of women in administrative positions. And in fact, the numbers of women who are superintendents in our state has increased very substantially within the last 3 years. It's not where it should be in my judgment, but nevertheless it has increased substantially. Let me shift to another area, and that is, of course, the area of competition in sports. This has been one aspect of Title IX that's been very important here in New York. A couple of years back, shortly after I became commissioner, we established new regulations in our state which would fit our own state programs together with federal requirements on assuring that there would be equal opportunities for girls to participate in sports. The principal concern was, of course, in competitive athletics, where there was a so-called contact sport. We developed a system here so that a girl who wished to participate in what had been previously called a contact sport could do so if, on examination by a physician and the assessment of the athletic director in the school, and another person selected by the girl or her parents, they determined that she was physically capable of being able to compete successfully and to her own health advantage in that contact sport. By and large, in our state, in the last 2 years, we have had a very smooth administration of that kind of competition. I'm very proud of that. I think we have as far-reaching a program in New York State in this area as there is any place in the nation. And if the federal ground rules change on this, we have an automatic way to change our state ground rules so that a student isn't caught in the middle between federal requirements and state requirements. Sure. There's 2 examples of 2 key places where we've been concerned with implementation of Title IX. There are several others, but I know time's limited, and perhaps I should hold those.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. And let me take time out for one more message here, and then we'll get back to the phones. We're running through our messages like crazy so we can get as much time in for the commissioner as possible.
It's
QBK.
I'd like to ask a question pertaining to an adult, like in reading comprehension. Is there any way that they could, you could get extra help with reading comprehension? I went back to school about 3 years ago to get a high school diploma, and my comprehension was not up there, and I asked about extra help, and all I was told, well, you just keep reading. Well, I was wondering if there's a little more to it than that. You know, understanding what you're reading, in other words.
There are many ways in which you can be helped by way of improving your reading comprehension.
I can't hear.
You can't hear. Would you, we're having trouble with this telephone wire. Why don't you hang up and listen, okay?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah.
There are many ways in which your reading comprehension can be assisted. There are lots of techniques to do that. I think your question is both about what techniques and where you might go to get some assistance. I didn't learn whether you had completed your high school equivalency program or your high school program. You certainly might want to check with your local school district for the availability of any direct programs for high school equivalency. You might, in addition, write to our department and ask for some materials on a program which we refer to as a degree of reading power. And that is a program in which we've developed new tests of reading comprehension and then techniques that go along with the test that can assist in building one's reading capacity.
Also, I was thinking for the caller, we've had guests on the program from Literacy Volunteers of America who might be able to help her out some, and that she can call them. I know they're in Rensselaer County and Albany County through the Voluntary Action Center in Albany County. That'll take it off the back of the public school system there. No, if she does need some help, it's sort of a one-to-one.
Well, I'm delighted to know when someone is genuinely looking for help in reading comprehension. The reports that have come out recently on general levels of literacy in our society are really very shocking. Literacy levels for adults, and any ways in which we can assist with the techniques that we've developed and the materials that we've developed on improving reading comprehension, we certainly want to do so. The voluntary efforts are strong. There are also, through colleges and universities now, many persons who are making their services available to help with those who want to learn to read better than they can already read at this point. The particular contribution that we've been making of late is in the measurement of the level of reading of an individual, whether it's a child or an adult. We can measure very precisely now just what level of comprehension they have, and then recommend materials which are just right for that level of comprehension. You want those materials to be a little bit more difficult than the person can now handle, but not so difficult that they get frustrated trying to work with them. Because if they can begin to tackle materials that are a little bit more difficult than their present level, then they build confidence and they gain, and they're able to ultimately gain very great strides in their comprehension.
We think of this country as a literate country. I guess we're not as literate as we'd like to think we are.
Well, when one looks at the kinds of challenges that we have by way of understanding environmental issues, by way of understanding issues of armaments and peace, by way of understanding issues of energy, then one recognizes that there is a level of learning for all of us as adults, that we must keep up with these current developments. And when you look at the statistics that show particularly about what age levels or grade levels of performance our adults have, then you recognize a very substantial gap between what we've got to be able to do in order to tackle these problems and where we appear to be by way of our current levels of competence.
A couple of weeks ago, Gordon, I had as a guest Sean Walmsley, who is a reading specialist at SUNY. And one of the things he'd been working on was government forms, and the fact that I don't remember the percentages now, but some horrible percentage can't read. We know nobody can figure out the income tax, but also simple Social Security forms, that sort of thing, and what to do about this. From what you said and from what he said, I'm thinking when talking about a gap, the new competency tests that are now in. If we have the competency tests, hopefully we're closing the gap. If I'm wrong, please correct me, but I would assume that's the reason for the competency test. But nobody has satisfactorily told me what happens to the people who don't pass the competency test. And I'm not talking about handicapped students now. I'm talking about those who might have a below average IQ, but definitely educable. Where are you going to put these people? What are you going to do with them?
Well, that's a very important question. The competency tests in themselves, of course, won't solve the problem. The competency tests are in place in order to assure that there's a standard of performance that's expected, and in order to know when students have in fact gained the level of competency that we believe they should have in order to complete a high school program and get a high school diploma. But you have to have, together with the competency tests, the programs that go into the preparation of the students in order to get there. When we put the requirements for competency testing in place last year, we also put in requirements for remedial instruction on the basis of 3rd grade and 6th grade and 9th grade tests, so that there'd be a build-up toward the ultimate performance on the competency testing program. So we see this not just as a set of tests at the end, but we see it as an entire program building up the level of competence. Now, even with that, and particularly with students who may already be in the upper grade levels, of course we have a concern for students who cannot, at this point, demonstrate their competency in these foundation skills. The requirement that they have to complete these tests before they can get a diploma is set, together with the requirement that's now in state law that any student is entitled to free public education in our state until the age of 21 or until they achieve a high school diploma. So that for some students who in fact do not complete the competency test and get their diploma when they might ordinarily do so at the age of 17 and 18, they must remember they have an option of continuing in free public education until the age of 21 in order to attain those skills and to display those competencies. That's the hinge between the requirement and the general statutory provision providing for free public education. If students haven't completed those competency test requirements by the regular age of leaving high school, we, of course, encourage that they then stick with it and develop those competencies before, at public expenditure, before that limit of age 21 runs out. But with the current rates that we have in this country of attendance at high school, the high percentages of those who are in school, I think there's no question but what, on successful application of our competency testing requirement, we will have a population which has a much more substantial level of literacy, a much higher percentage of the overall adult population. And of course, this grows as those who are reaching the age of 20, 21 and have that level of skill grows.
Okay, that's a very thorough explanation. I'm still not sure what we're going to do with these people who are being babysat in school until they're 16 and old enough to drop out, and whether you're going to run into more people dropping out because they don't want to face the competency test. And I can't ask you to answer that now because we have 1 minute of news, which I forgot to tell you about. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Hang on the phones.
American.
I have a million things I'd like to ask you some more about the competency test. Maybe some of our callers will, but so we'll get to them. Hello, you're on QBK.
Question for Mr. Ambach. What would you do if you had a senior in high school who is taking advanced placement English, and the teacher of the course is the head of the school's English department? He apparently is a good manager or executive or whatever, but he is not a good teacher. He is not incompetent. You cannot say he's incompetent. But he drones on, does a soliloquy constantly, he discourages or doesn't stimulate any discussion in the class. And the kids are bright. They're very much aware that they're not getting out of this course what the kids who took it last year from another teacher got out of the course. They're just not stimulated, and they know that they want to get a good grade on this test, which I understand we parents will be paying $35 for at the end of the year. Is there any way that this can be handled? There are several other English teachers in the school who are much better teachers that they've had before. They know that they could handle the course better.
Hello? Yeah, we sort of went off there, but you're there.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
What would you do in that case?
All right, see if you can hear...
What have the students do?
All right. See if you can hear Commissioner Ambach, otherwise we'll have to hang up or something.
I have two suggestions for you. Can you hear?
It's very dim, so I think I will hang up and listen on the radio.
Sure.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. At least it's dim. It's encouraging.
I have two suggestions for you. I think perhaps one's been followed. I would urge first that your child and perhaps some of his colleagues make it clear to the teacher that their expectations are that they should be perhaps working harder or get more of a challenge in the course or would like a little different treatment on some of the subject. I believe in a very direct approach of that sort. If, in fact, there is a problem that is not satisfactory, then my second suggestion would be for the children and perhaps for parents with them to address their same concerns to the principal of the school. An advanced placement course, as any other course, is an important experience for children, and I think that clearly they should express, you should express your concern to the local authorities. That's the key.
If they go to the principal, are they going to get any satisfaction, or is the principal going to have to back up the teacher?
Well, it's very difficult to make a judgment.
After all, in this case, you said he was head of the department. You know, I can't imagine the principal saying, "Okay, kids, we'll see what we'll get you a new teacher."
Well, it's very difficult to speculate, and I can't speculate on this case. Obviously, your caller has a very particular circumstance in mind. I don't know what the facts are. I can only just make a recommendation by way of a general approach, and I think that's an important one as a direct approach, first to the teacher, and then if there's not satisfaction, a very direct approach to the principal.
The caller mentioned the AP exams, which are the most expensive ones, at least certainly on a high school level, for at $35 a throw. But it brings me back to what's been so much in the news this week, especially, and this is the truth in testing, where ETS has said, Educational Testing Service has said that if whatever they continue, they'll have to raise their prices, and a lot of graduate exams, I guess, especially, are being dropped and such. Would you like to comment on this whole truth in testing business? It's rather confusing to those of us who are not in the educational field.
Yeah, I'd be pleased to comment on the legislation. It was this past year that our legislature put the admissions testing legislation in place, and that legislation requires that after a test is given, a test for admission, either to undergraduate or to graduate school studies here in New York, after that test is given and the results are tabulated, then the test sponsor or the test agency must make the test available generally to the public, and also must make available to any student who took the examination a copy of the test, the correct answers, and a copy of the student's answer sheet. Now, the difficulty that this has posed for the test agencies is that in the past these examinations have been secure, which means that the test questions are not revealed at all. And it means that the questions in different combinations can be used over and over again in other tests. And of course, if you can't use those questions over again, you have to pay money, they have to spend money in order to develop new forms of the test. Now, this legislation is in place in New York. It's effective on the 1st of January of 1980. And we have been surveying the different test sponsors to find out whether they are going to continue to test in New York. Unfortunately, that survey is showing some very, very drastic measures that are being taken by the test sponsors. There are 26 different tests, and the SATs are only one out of that set of 26. 26 different tests which have been offered in New York for admissions purposes. The sponsors of those 26 tests have now indicated to us that 20 of them will no longer be given within New York State. These are tests for admission to medical school, tests for admission to optometric school, tests for admission to dentistry school, and a variety of other tests for graduate schools. One of them is called the Miller Analogies. Another one is the Graduate Records Exam. Now, those will no longer be given in New York State. The SATs, which are sponsored by the College Board and produced by the Educational Testing Service, will be given in New York State, but the schedule will be reduced. This past year, there have been 14 different times during the course of a year when there would be tests given. Starting in 1980, that will be reduced to 7 times. And particularly the testing which has gone on Sundays to accommodate those children who, for religious reasons, wouldn't take their test on Saturdays, those will be very substantially reduced. And also they will reduce the numbers of times when handicapped children who formerly had received special testing in between the regular administration can take these tests. So we'll have a very much reduced opportunity for our students in New York State to take these examinations. And beyond that, the ones that are going to be given in New York will cost more than they did before, because the special provisions that the test sponsors now have to put in place are going to cost more, and they feel they must charge New York students for those. They can't spread that across the country because it's a New York law.
Well, what's going to happen to students who want to enter med school from New York State? Are they going to have to go out of state to take the test, or are they going to have to say, plead, a handicap that I'm from New York State?
That will depend, of course, on what continue to be requirements by the medical schools for admission. If a student from New York State wishes to be admitted to a school that's going to use those results, yes, they will have to go outside of the state to take the test. Let me point out one more factor about this law. This law is not just limited to tests taken within New York State. The law is phrased in such a way that any test results used in New York State are meant to then be public, which means that a test taken outside of the state, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, whatnot, but the results of which might be used for admission back in New York State is also meant to be subject to the same disclosure.
In other words, well, the law board, you didn't mention LSATs. They're not in on that, I don't think.
The law test?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
They're in on that, too?
But at the present
Are they one of the 6, though, that are still being given?
The final determination isn't in on that, but it appears as though that law test will be given within New York State, perhaps on a reduced basis.
I see, because I just threw that one out because my son probably will be taking the LSATs in the state of New Jersey. But let's say, and he would apply to Columbia Law School, for example. Now, that test under the new law would have to become public even though he takes it in another state.
That's the interpretation which we have and with which we've discussed. We've discussed that with the governor's office and the sponsors of this legislation. and that's the interpretation.
Would you say that this is handicapping New York State students in college applications?
Well, I opposed this legislation right from the start because I was very much concerned that it would limit opportunities for New York State students to take these exams and also would result in increased cost. That was only a matter of speculation, of course, when the legislation was being considered. The fact is that now the results are showing that that's true. We're going to have a far reduced opportunity for our students, and we're going to have greater costs for the test that they're taking.
Okay, final question on the test before we go to some callers. If a student has financial hardship taking this test, is there any recourse that he can take any place? Does ETS or college boards or whatever help pick up the tab for that?
As a matter of policy, and this is differed from the different test sponsors, they have generally provided to the effect that to afford the fees for the test has been impossible for a student. But it's not a widespread practice. It couldn't be.
No.
But it is. There have been opportunities provided for students who simply could not afford to take the test themselves.
Okay, we're going to take about a 2-minute break for some messages and then to the telephones. Mara's Pharmacy at 2. We've been waiting a long, long time. Let's get to them. Hi, you're on QBK, finally. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, finally. It's tough when you have a guest that you're interested in because you'd like to ask a lot of questions yourself.
Well, some of the questions are questions the callers wanted to hear about.
All right, I have two questions on completely different related subjects.
Okay.
One is last week I saw a program on Channel 17 about Johnny reading, and apparently there's a new system for testing that's going to be used. I wonder if the commissioner would like to explain that a little bit. And the other question is about these learning centers that we have locally. Are they sanctioned by the state education department? Do they get any funding from them? And what is his opinion of the value of them?
Okay, you want to hang up?
Radio, yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Let me answer the second question first. The department does not license or charter or officially sanction learning centers. Those are organized privately to provide services in special tutorial ways. Very often they focus on reading, but of course they do provide services in other subjects. We do not rate them or rank them by way of their capability, and so I cannot give you an indication of my own view or the department's view of their quality. I think that's a matter that a person or family that chooses to use such a center has to make. That's a judgment they've got to make. Let me turn to your first question about testing techniques. A little bit ago, I referred to our program, which we call the Degrees of Reading Power. For the last 7 years, we've been developing a new test of reading comprehension. We've done that with foundation support. Carnegie Corporation has supported it. In my view, and I think it's the view of reading experts across the country, it is now probably the most sophisticated and certainly one of the best, if not the best, test of reading comprehension. It genuinely measures what level of comprehension a student or an adult has. And it's very useful for us now in instruction within the schools to help to measure what a child can do and then set the materials that the child ought to have along with that capacity. And we're using that concept now in our competency testing program in reading. The value of it in the competency testing program is that in reading, we are trying to assure that high school students display a competence of reading which tells us that they can master the textbooks that are used in the high schools. And our tests can be very closely associated with the level of difficulty of the textbooks used at the 11th and the 12th grade levels, so that we have in this test a very accurate measure of whether students are actually able to comprehend the kind of material that they're supposed to be using in the secondary schools.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another call. Hello, you're on QBK. Hi.
I've been hanging so long. And
You sure have.
I was going to have a caller right in the middle, but I'm going to see if I don't get distracted. A friend of mine who was a teacher of, or a professor of English at Temple University hates, loathes, and despises that phrase back to basics, and he prefers to substitute forward to literacy, so I got a chuckle when I heard the forward to fundamentals. Now, I have to kind of lead into this question a little bit. We were fortunate this summer at the conference of our Reading Reform Foundation to have Dr. James Kerner of the Sloan Foundation speak to us. And he was speaking to us. I have a transcript of my notes here, and there's 14 pages, but don't get scared. I'm not going.
Thank you.
I'm not going to go into all of that. But he, of course, spoke as to why the Sloan Foundation in the first place started to explore the problem as far as writing, the teaching of writing, is concerned, and not specifically in New York State. Of course, this is nationwide. And what he said, above all, it seemed to us that the principal problem was the fact that the schools simply did not devote enough time and attention to the teaching of writing. He said practice, after all, is essential to any successful kind of a writing program. And he said they found training inadequacies in colleges, both pre-service and post-service. Too many teachers had never really been trained in writing. Very few had had advanced composition courses, and so on. So I have a feeling that this is something that we would like to hear about, what is being done in New York State as far as insisting on stronger writing courses in our colleges and in the low grades.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. You want to hang up and listen then, since we're having trouble with the phone?
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm very pleased you put an emphasis on writing. I agree with your general observation that it's in the area of writing that we perhaps have the most distance to travel. In addition to our competency tests in reading and in mathematics, we have established a competency testing program in writing. I think it's fair to say that over the past years, the testing of writing has not been handled very adequately. It's one thing to be able to test reading, particularly when you're giving large-scale tests over a massive number of students. But when you're testing writing, then you have to have a system where you have individuals reading that writing and judging it, weighing off matters of style with matters of content, weighing off the punctuation, the spelling, the grammar, and trying to assess what the quality of that writing is. Much more difficult than when we're measuring reading and arithmetic. We have, in focusing on this area, developed here some new instruments to test the writing at the level of competence that we expect for high school students. And the technique that we have been using attempts to look at samples of the student's writing as a whole and weigh off these different elements of style, of content, and of structure, and of the grammar and spelling that's used. We're very confident that the requirement in writing is indeed having an effect of increasing the attention that's given in the schools to writing. We can see that already. And we can see the attempt in the lower grades of preparing students to be able to tackle these exercises in writing. I think that the very requirement of writing as a competence testing requirement is one that's already had a substantial impact on instruction, and I think will increase its impact on what happens in the instructional program.
Hooray. For those of us who are horrified at the thought of colleges and universities having to give remedial English courses, remedial writing, whatever, I'm so happy to hear that there's going to be more done on the lower levels. Because college isn't the time to start it. If you don't have some idea of what a sentence is, you've got a problem before you get to college. Hooray for that. Okay, we'll get back to the phones after this. But are you looking for something, Commissioner Gordon Ambach, about education? And let's take a call. Hello, you're on QBK.
Hi. I wanted to ask about scholarships. I know they are based on the SATs or PSATs. Now that they're going to be more expensive, will this limit the amount of students that can take it or will want to take it for the scholarship exam in New York State? And are they still going to give medical scholarships? And what happens with those that they used to give?
What kind? You say medical scholarships? You mean for medical schools or?
That's right.
Oh, okay.
Because when my son got out, he went to and took a test and got a medical scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what's going to happen to those in this truth in open sunshine law, whatever it is. And I wanted to know what was the reason for the legislature ever wanting to pass a law like this.
Okay, you want to hang up and listen?
Yes, and I just can't talk back to him, which has really been
well,
tough today.
Well, wait a minute. Hold on and see if you can hear. If you can't hear, then we'll say hold on.
I'll hang up
okay.
because it's nearly the end of your program.
Right. Okay, fine. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Questions there. Let me deal with them as quickly as I can. In New York State, the Regent scholarships are awarded on the basis of SAT or ACT scores. We used to have our own Regent scholarship examination that was given. We developed it in the department, and then all students who wished to have a scholarship could take that. The legislature, in order to save money for that test, then shifted to the system of using the SATs and the ACTs. And it's those scores which determine scholarships. We'll continue to do that. The difficulty may be that with an increased cost of those examinations for students, there may be some students who decide they will not take the SATs or the ACTs and therefore not be eligible for a scholarship.
But if the colleges continue to require the SATs, then they're going to have to take them.
They will, but there are lots of colleges that don't require the SATs.
Okay.
And
right.
so many students don't have to take them except because they're interested in a scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the important point. On the medical scholarships, there's a very important point. We are going to face the difficulty that we have no instrument to be able to determine which students would have the medical scholarship. That was not anticipated when the legislation was enacted by the legislature, but the fact that we cannot use the medical exam within New York State is going to mean that we'll have to find some other arrangement, and frankly at this point I don't know what other arrangement, in order to be able to make a determination as to who wins the medical scholarships, the dental scholarships, and the scholarships for optometry. That's a very real problem. Now if I can come back to the third part, which was the reason why the law went into place. Those persons who advocated this legislation, and the governor in signing this legislation, were concerned about openness in testing and believed that it would be to the advantage of students if they could have access to the test they had taken and access to the answers for those tests. I think the principal concern was that if you made all of these test questions and correct responses public, then it would diminish the advantage that some students might have or have had in the past to have access to special tutorial arrangements or preparatory arrangements getting them ready for these kinds of tests. That's a debatable point, but the argument that I think carried the day on this legislation was hinged around the belief that it was important to have an openness of the questions and the responses so that anybody could have advantage of seeing what was coming up next. I might point out that California law requires that there be a model of every test, not the exact test questions, but a model or a sample test for each of the types of admission tests that's made available annually. And anybody can look at that and get a sense of what they have to take in that test. But of course they don't see the exact answers. Well, I advocated that we do the same thing here in New York, because then you don't have the problem of security with each and every exam, but you have the advantage that any student can get an idea of what would be expected of that student on a particular test.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know on the graduate school levels, but certainly there are sample tests available for SAT and PSAT people to get some idea of what they're going to be asking. And it seemed to make sense. Do you have any feeling that perhaps we might see a change in the law when there is enough confusion over who's going to get what scholarships and who's going to get into what kind of med school, et cetera, et cetera?
Perhaps a little too early to predict whether there would be a change in the law. We were asked by the governor to develop a report of the impact of this legislation. And what I've been commenting on today is the result of the surveying that we've done of the test sponsors. We're preparing that report now for the governor and for the members of the legislature. We're now going to send the results from the test sponsors to all the colleges and universities and get their reaction as to what that's going to mean to them in their own admissions practices. Mm-hmm. When we have those results, we'll make them available to the legislature, and there may be some reason for some adjustments in this statute as the legislature sees it. But I think it's a bit early to predict what might happen by way of changes.
Okay. Before we say goodbye, a caller called earlier before you came today about. I bet I'm going to phrase this wrong, and we're not going to get the answer that she wanted. But she said, aren't teachers, basically what she said is, aren't teachers supposed to act in place of parents in the schools? What is it, in loco parentis?
In loco parentis.
Yes. She was talking about it not in college level now, but at high school and elementary school. What responsibilities of the parental type, if any, do teachers have in the schools?
Well, while children are in school, of course, those in authority, the teachers and the principals, have a responsibility for the health and the safety of the child. And, of course, they clearly have responsibility to teach. Mm-hmm. All of the responsibilities for the subjects and for learning which is expected at that time. That's a general response, but those are really the general requirements. I think what's most important when we talk about parent and school relations is that there is a clear understanding between parents and school authorities and a clear consistency of what they expect of the student. That's what may have led to this question, but what's most important on matters of discipline, on matters of academic expectation, what the student is supposed to be performing, the most important thing for good results is to be sure that there's a fit between what the parent expects and what the school expects.
And that could be another 14 programs. I want to thank you, Commissioner Ambach, for coming. It's been very informative, and we've enjoyed it very, very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for being with us.